Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So this morning's topic is potentially a little bit tricky. It's one of those topics that can be divisive. People have very strong opinions one way or another. Not the reason why I chose it or why God put it on my heart, but I feel it's very pertinent, especially at the moment. And as I was researching, it probably hit me that many of us may not be aware quite how pertinent it is. So I'm going to, Andrew, if you could please put up the first slide. I'm going to put out show you some pictures. You tell me who it depicts and what it's basically saying. So, tell me, yeah, who can read German? Yes, Jewish people negatively, that's another one. So what does it basically say about Jewish people? It's like evil. And there's another one. The top says Germany will survive as long as it recognizes that the Jews are the mortal enemy of mankind. What's interesting, and this goes back to, so how do we know these are Jews? Yeah, like very often, like with the big noses, that's an anti-Semitic stereotype, and it stems back to the 1930s, Germany. Like it had been around before, but it became really prominent, and the next pictures have the same, hooked nose. Now, what's interesting about these pictures is, well, this one obviously goes back to 1930 Germany. This one is from modern-day Australia. It was displayed in the front window of the Toowoomba Antique Centre just a few weeks ago. And the text that was displayed with it read, "The Zionists own your government, install all politicians, control the justice system." This one was a flyer, and it was distributed by a Baptist church in Cairns a few weeks ago. It came with a Bible verse. The Bible verse says, "He that loveth silver shall not be satisfied with silver." Portrays basically the Jews as money-lusting unbelievers, and makes the point that all money-lusting unbelievers will go to hell. Now, the chair of the Anti-Defamation Commission said, "Who would have thought that in 2024 Australia, we would see a church spreading such degrading stereotypes of Jews?" Like, especially for a church to spread that is sad. Now, since October of last year, that's when Hamas, a Palestinian terrorist organization, massacred about 1,200 people in Israel and took many other hostage. Hate crimes have skyrocketed across the globe. Jews have been attacked openly in what we would describe as civilized countries. In France, a Jewish teacher was stabbed. In Egypt, the police actually shot a few Jewish tourists, and so on. Synagogues have been set on fire. One country included Germany. There have been, you may have seen that on the news, anti-Semitic demonstrations. Here in Australia, there has been a 738% increase in attacks against Jews and Israeli individuals and institutions. And just a few weeks ago, I don't know if you heard about that, one of our MPs, a Jewish MP, Josh Burns, his office was attacked. Jewish slogans were sprayed on the windows and they set it on fire. There have been similar attacks on other offices. Neo-Nazi networks have risen in number, and they promise to, what did they say? They promise to finish the job Hitler started. Now, the survivors of the Holocaust, they're often in their 90s, or, one lady's 100, but they say they haven't seen this kind of violence since Nazi Germany. So it made me think, and I really feel God put it on my heart. Like, I was wondering, why is it that the Jews are hated so much? Like there are other minority groups that are persecuted and hated, but for the Jews it's almost like it's unique in the way how they have been hated over centuries and centuries and centuries, over basically in every country. So the question I want to ask this morning is, why is it that the Jews are hated so much? What does it mean? Like the Jews say that the chosen people of God, is that what it looks like to be the favored people of God, to be persecuted like this? And then what is our role as Christians in all of this? Now, first to the question, why are the Jews hated so much? There have been different theories, and I won't go into great detail, but I just want to mention a few of them. And the one that is very common is the deicide theory, which is that the Jews are hated because they killed Jesus. And it's true that for 2,000 years, Christians have been persecuting Jews, like the church fathers early on, and theologians in the Middle Ages ranted against the Jews, and Martin Luther was one of them. He even wrote a book, The Jews and Their Lies, and in it he calls for the destruction of prayer books, the burning of their homes, and the death of their rabbis. So it's pretty drastic. The problem with the theory is that firstly it was the Romans that killed Jesus, it wasn't the Jews, because only Roman authorities could actually authorize crucifixions. But the world doesn't hate the Italians. So, and secondly, anti-Semitism existed a long, long time before Jesus was crucified. In Exodus, we read about the Jews being slaves to Egypt. In 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, we read about the Babylonian captivity, after which Israel was dispersed across the globe and pretty much unwelcome in every country that they went to. One Greek king, this was in the 2nd century BC before Christ, he forbade Jewish practices, persecuted the Jews, and sacrificed swine in the Jewish temple. So persecution was there a long time before Christ came. Now, another theory is the outsiders theory. A Greek historian in the 4th century BC writes that the Jews have often been treated injuriously by the kings and governors, and when they have torments inflicted upon them and they are brought to the most terrible kinds of death, so that's 4th century BC, they meet them after an extraordinary manner and will not renounce the religion of their forefathers. So basically what he's saying is that the Jewish people have a reputation for refusing to adapt to the customs of the country they live in, and that's why they're hated. This is not always true. Even in the Bible it says, and I'm not quite sure if I don't think I've got that up there. The Bible has numerous passages where it says the Jews followed, that's in 2 Kings, the Jews followed the practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before them, or Psalm 106. They mingled with the nations and adopted their customs. And the Jews often have also tried to assimilate to Europe, but it didn't matter, like they were still persecuted. Now, there are a couple of other theories, just very briefly. One is the chosen theory, like they're hated and persecuted because they claim to be chosen, but that is not entirely true either. In the 19th century, the Jews actually rejected their status as chosen people, which is kind of sad that it got to this point, but they just wanted to fit in. Or the economic theories, the Jews are hated because they possess too much wealth and power. It's not always true, like often they had no power, they had no political influence, and they had no money. The racial theory, the Jews are hated because they're an inferior race, like that's just ridiculous. And the scapegoat theory, the Jews are hated because they are the cause for all the world's problems. Again, it's kind of ridiculous. So none of these theories hold water, which again leaves us to ask, where does the hate come from? One Messianic Rabbi, Jason Sobel, I don't know if you've heard about him, says there is no logical explanation for the depth of hate against the Jews. And he says it only makes sense if there's a spiritual dimension to it. the atrocities committed against the Jews, especially against babies, like after Hamas attacked, or in Nazi Germany, like the demonic, like you can't explain that. He says the slaughter of babies is not logical, it's demonic. And he also makes the point that anti-Semitism is not really an ideology because no one can explain what it actually is. So he says, yeah, it's a demonic spirit. In 2 Corinthians, do I have that? No. Never mind. In 2 Corinthians, it says, the God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers. Which I think is totally true. I read the other day that one of the neo-Nazi leaders, like leaders of the network in Australia, like he, how shall I say it, he believes he's the brains of the operation, so he thinks he's a very clever man. And just a few weeks ago he said, and I quote, racism was the most beautiful way to live, and Hitler's so wholesome, a loving soul. And I'm like, on what planet can you take those statements seriously? So that really only makes sense if you kind of go, well, their minds are blinded. Greg Sheridan, like he's a foreign affairs journalist, and he writes in The Australian, he is actually a clever man. So he writes, anti-Semitism, the hatred of Jews is deranged, but widespread. It's the most difficult hatred of all to understand, partly because it's irrational, it's evil. And then he continues to say, the world owes the sure knowledge of one God to Jewish experience and practice, Jewish experience and tradition, and perhaps that's the real cause of anti-Semitism, and the spirit of evil has never forgiven them. So what he's basically saying, it's the spirit of evil, which is the devil. The devil hates God, and he hates the Jews because the Jews are proof or evidence or a sign that God is real and that he is impacting this world, that he's involved in this world. So the Jews revealed God and his purposes to the world, and that's why they're hated. Another Jewish theologian, he said, he calls Israel the mystery of God's intervention in human history. So why is Israel a mystery? And he says, despite war and persecution, exile, dispersion of the nation over the last 4,000 years, they still exist, like they're still here. Now everyone's attacking them. All the nations are attacking them. They haven't had their own country for a long, long time, and yet they're still here. Israel is actually the only nation on earth that inhabits the same land, is still called by the same name, speaks the same language, and worships the same God that it did thousands of years ago. So, it is a mystery. And therefore, Israel's experience is proof to the world that God is real, and that is why they're hated by the devil. Now, the entire Bible is basically a record of God intervening in the history of the Jews, and it's a record of what God has done with the Jews and with the Jewish people. But it's not only a record, and this is what distinguishes Christianity from any other religion. We've got Old Testament prophecies, and these prophecies speak into the life of Israel, and especially over the last 100 years, we have been able to see some of these prophecies come true. And so the Bible is proof, and Israel is proof that what God has said he would do, he actually has done. And I'll give you a couple of examples, a couple of Old Testament prophecies. The Bible predicted that the temple would be destroyed and Israel would be scattered. Okay, so eventually I'll get the hang of it. Okay, we've been past that on. Okay, number one, the temple is destroyed and Israel scattered. In Leviticus 26, let's see, here, I'm getting it. It says, I will scatter you among the nations and will draw out my sword and pursue you. Your land will be laid waste and your cities will lie in ruins. And in Luke 21, Jesus says, as some disciples were remarking how wonderful the temple looked, Jesus said, as for what you see here, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down. And in 70 AD, the Romans actually destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed the temple, and Israel was scattered among the nations. And the Jews basically then had no homeland for 2,000 years. The next one. Will I learn? Israel becomes a nation again. Now, all prophecies foretold that Israel would continue to exist and that it would become a nation again. In Isaiah 66, it says, "Who has ever seen anything strange as this? Whoever has heard of such a thing? Has a nation ever been born in a single day? Has a country ever come forth in a mere moment? But by the time Jerusalem's birth pains begin, her children will be born." In Ezekiel 36. "For I will take you out of the nations. I will gather you from all the countries and will bring you back into your own land." Now, after World War II, the Jews illegally migrated back into Palestine, and in 1947, the UN then decided to propose a two-state solution, which meant that land would be divided. Israel would become would have one part and be able to be a nation. Palestine would receive the other part and be able to be a nation, and they should live peacefully next to each other, which hasn't happened. But Palestine declined. Israel accepted, and in 1948 they became a nation again, an independent nation, which was a miracle. Number 3, the Bible predicted that Jerusalem would be at the center of controversy, which it has been, and play a key role in a war between Israel and other nations, and that Jerusalem would be restored to Israel. Zechariah, "I will make Jerusalem like an intoxicating drink that makes the nearby nations stagger. When they send their armies to besiege Jerusalem, all the nations will gather against it and try to move it, but they will only hurt themselves." And Zechariah 8, "This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will save my people from the countries of the east and west. I will bring them back to live in Jerusalem." And that was fulfilled in 1967, when Israel won the Six-Day War. It was fought between Israel and the Arab nations, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. And it was a miraculous victory because, like back then, all the other nations, there were more, and the armies, they had all the weapons. Israel didn't really have anything. And still they won and took back the city of Jerusalem after almost 2,000 years. Now, one that we probably haven't heard of, which I found interesting, Isaiah 35 says, "The wilderness and dry land will be glad, the desert will rejoice and blossom like a lily." Now, what I hadn't realized was that as soon as Israel became a nation again, they began to work the land, and they developed such revolutionary methods, agricultural methods, that even the sand started to produce crops. Now, Israel has been, since then, has for many years been a major exporter, and is still today a major exporter of flowers to Europe. It will blossom like a lily. Number 5, Zephaniah says, "For then I will return to the people a pure language, spelling mistake, sorry, that they may all call upon the name of the Lord and serve him with one consent." Now, from the 2nd century after Christ, Hebrew wasn't actually a spoken language anymore, it just became a written language. So the Jews really had no didn't have their own language to speak, and was only in the late 1800s that one Jewish person revived the ancient language, and since then there have been, sorry, I didn't even put that up. And since then, Hebrew has been a spoken language among the Jews again. So the language was restored. Last one. Ezekiel 38 and 39, like it's 2 chapters, and they speak of a major military attack against the state of Israel once Israel is restored as a nation. Like it's really both chapters, but I've just picked out a couple of verses just to give you a flavor. You will devise an evil scheme, and this is God speaking to the enemies of Israel. You will say, I will invade the land of unwalled villages. I will attack a peaceful and unsuspecting people. You will come from your place in the far north, you and many nations with you, all of them riding on horses. Well, we don't have horses today. A mighty army will advance against my people Israel like a cloud that covers the land. Now God, in those chapters, God basically says that a military attack would be comprised of 6 different nations, and one of these nations is Persia, and Persia is today's Iran, and Iran in April this year actually attacked Israel. The other nations that are mentioned in the Bible, if you translate them into modern nations, are all Islamic nations, and many of them are actually supporting Hamas. Now the word Hamas in Arabic means zeal or passion, but it's also, which again I didn't realize, maybe you had heard of that, but it's also a Hebrew word, and it occurs in the Bible. There's one passage in Ezekiel, and it says, prepare chains for my people, for the land is bloodied by terrible crimes. Jerusalem is filled with violence, and the word for violence is Hamas. Jerusalem is filled with Hamas. Now, Jerusalem today is literally being embattled with by Hamas. Hamas wants an independent Palestinian state, and they want Jerusalem as their capital. So Jerusalem is literally embattled by Hamas. Okay, I want to go to one future prophecy. What's going to happen? In Romans 11:26, Paul says, and in this way all Israel will be saved, as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion, he will banish ungodliness for Jacob. Now Paul says that all of Israel will be saved, and there's some debate over what exactly that means. So I want to look at it in context. And a little earlier, Paul says, but if some of the branches were broken off, and you, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others, you now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree. Do not be arrogant toward the branches. If you are, remember, it is not you who supported the root, but it's the root that supports you. Then you will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in, and that is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief, but you stand fast through faith. So do not become proud, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. And that tells us 2 things. The first one is that the Jewish are the original branches, and they're the historic chosen people of God, and they were chosen to inherit God's promises first, and therefore they have some sort of priority over us because we only came later, and we then benefited by being grafted in. Now Jason Sobel, like he's a Messianic Jew, and he grew up in a traditional Jewish family. He said he wanted God to be real in his life, but at home it was quite traditional. They went to synagogue and everything, but he didn't really have an experience of God. And so he wanted a real encounter with God, and so he became involved in New Age, and he said he became a Jubu, which I'd never heard of before. A Jubu is apparently a Jewish Buddhist. So, like you're dabbling in all of those different things, and still go to synagogue, still call yourself a Jew. But anyway, so he did that, and as part of that, he got into meditating, and so he was sitting down and was meditating. And he said he had this experience where his spirit actually left the body, and he went to heaven, and he saw the king. He saw a king on the throne. And even though he'd really not heard about Jesus, he said he knew this was Jesus. And Jesus, let me check, but Jesus asked him to serve him and said, you will come and serve me. And so when he came out of that, he actually became a Christian or Messianic Jew, and then started ministry. Later, a few years later, he had another very similar experience. And he said he again left his body and he went up to heaven. And in heaven, he heard two songs. One was a Hebrew song, and the other one was a contemporary worship song. And he asked, Lord, what is that? What does it mean? And Jesus showed him the book of Revelation, and there's a passage where it says, they sang the song of Moses and the Lamb. And he said, okay, so what does that mean? And Jesus explained, this represents the great revival that is going to happen, and it's going to happen as a result of Jew and Gentile coming together as one people. So the Song of Moses represents the Jews and the Old Testament, and the Song of the Believers represents the New Testament. And when these two songs merge, when these two people come together, it's a picture of one people, like Jew and Gentile, coming together. And this is a step that will lead into, or will usher in, a great revival. And he said in his words, it's one of the greatest revivals we've ever seen. So, Romans 15:27 says, for if the Gentiles have been partakers of the spiritual things, their duty is also to minister to them in material things. So, Jews have priority, we're grafted into the same salvation now, and this is the coming together. We're grafted in together. But Paul also says, since we now have been partakers, since we have been grafted in, and are beneficiaries of the promises, the spiritual things, it means we need to, we have a responsibility to minister to them in material things. And the word for minister is liturgio. It means to serve someone, aid someone in their need. And for the Roman Christians, it actually, back then, they were poor, and so for them it meant that they would be served with material things, like with clothing, with food, with money. The call for us is still the same. We're still being grafted in with the Jewish nation, under the name of Jesus with the Jews, and the salvation that Jesus brought to the Jews first. But it also means that we have a responsibility to assist. And in today's day and age, it may look a little bit different. Maybe it's not material things, but considering the political situation, we have to ask ourselves, is there a place for us to actually speak up for, persecuted Jews? In Toowoomba, we haven't seen it much, but I know that certainly down in Sydney, in the major cities, even in the public bathrooms, it's kill the Jews. It's everywhere, and there's a place for us to stand up. Following the attacks in October, the Holocaust survivors got together and kind of said this is really horrible, and they brought out a statement. And in that statement, they're actually asking for our help. And I quote, "We ask all Australians to denounce the anti-Semitism and hatred that we see today in our beautiful country and across the globe. We ask you to stand with us." When, one of the reasons why the anti-Semitism and the hate and the persecution of Jews in Nazi Germany escalated the way it did was because people stayed silent. I do remember talking to my grandma. It was 30 years ago. She's long passed away. But because I said, like, you knew what was going on, didn't you? And she's like, oh, she said, we saw first it all looked good. Everything was getting better. Like before, there was unemployment and riots in the streets, and economically it wasn't good. And she said then Hitler came in and things started to be better, and so no one was asking questions, everyone was happy. And then she said, like everyone had work, the riots were gone, and she said at work, she was working in an office, all of a sudden the Jewish co-workers would disappear one at a time. And she said, at first we did actually believe the propaganda, because I was like, come on, She said, no, we did believe that they were going to camps to work and play, basically. Like they had some good times, but they were put to work as well. And she said, because everyone was because the country was in a good state, we didn't ask too many questions. And she did say it got to the point where you started to realize something was going on. And she said it was too late by then, like we were so afraid for ourselves, because we knew if we spoke up, or she said, didn't even dare, if there was a Jewish colleague walking on the other side, or on the same side of the road, you would actually cross the street because you were too scared if you even had contact with them. And it's hard to envision being in that situation, but you kind of go, I hope I would be different, but if we're not speaking up today, like we won't be any different than that. Okay, so that's one thing, speak up. And the second thing those Bible passages tell us is, now Paul says all of Israel will be saved. And I guess I've heard the question before, well, does that actually mean that because they are the chosen people of God, they do not have to believe in Jesus? Like, are they saved anyway? Or, do they need to believe in Jesus? What do you think? Have to believe in Jesus? Paul talks very clearly about the passage we read about the branches that are broken off, and he says they're broken off because of their unbelief. So those that do not believe in Jesus, and it applies to Jew and Gentile, every person on earth is saved only by their faith in Jesus, and that includes the Jews. So when Paul says all of Israel will be saved, most commentators kind of go like, it refers to the nation of Israel, not to every single individual Jew, but the nation as a whole will turn to Jesus. So that means Paul basically prophesies that, more and more the nation of Israel will turn to Jesus. It also means that the Jewish people will need to hear the gospel. Jesus said that he was sent not only to the lost only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And so, Paul and the disciples, they ministered to the Jews. Paul says, and did I put that up? Oh, no, not yet. Sorry. Paul says in Romans 1:16, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God for salvation, to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Now, liturgio means to minister, to serve someone, but it actually also means to minister someone by bringing them the gospel. So sharing the gospel with the Jews is actually part of God's plans, and part of God's plans for us. We may not have any Jews in Toowoomba at the moment that we're in contact with, but if we do come across Jewish people, they actually need to hear the gospel too. John Piper, he's a pastor and theologian. He believes that bringing the gospel to the Jews is actually, I missed that one. Missed out on that quote. It's still, we're meant to speak up. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he was one of the pastors and theologians during Nazi Germany, and he said, silence in the face of evil is evil itself. God will not hold us guiltless, not to speak is to speak, and not to act is to act. Okay, now John Piper, he said, it seems to me that Paul does mean that in connection with the second coming of Christ, there will be a great turning of Israel to Christ. Just how it works, I don't know. And as we said before, like this one Messianic Rabbi, he had the vision of Jew and Gentile coming together, and it would usher in a great revival. So basically, John Piper also believes like something is happening. And the thing is, there is actually signs, and I didn't know that. There are signs that this is actually beginning to happen. Jonathan Bernis, he's another Messianic rabbi, and he said that Jewish people are coming to faith all over the world in numbers not seen since the book of Acts. He said for almost 2,000 years, there have been hardly any Jews turning to Christianity. But he said after 1967, after Israel got Jerusalem back, the numbers have skyrocketed. He says, like, before 1967, there was not one single Messianic congregation, but now there are, let me see, more than 350, which doesn't sound a massive number, but it is, it is a start. 360 Messianic Jewish congregations with about 100 in Israel. There are tens of thousands of Messianic Jews in the United States. Now he says too, like Satan wants to eradicate the Jewish people to prove that God is not trustworthy, that he will not do what he said. And miracles are actually happening within the Jewish community. And again, some of it was new to me. And Jesus, we've heard of Jesus appearing to the Muslims, but Jesus is apparently also appearing to Jewish people. And he said in his congregation, because he's got a congregation in, is it New York? I forget. He said he had two women turn up, and he said to them, because they, wanted to join. He said, who brought the gospel to you? Like, who told you? And she said, no one. And he said, what do you mean? And they said, well, Jesus actually appeared to us in physical form, and he told us. And so we became Christians, and then they looked online and found the congregation. Another Jewish man, he's a doctor. He got married again, grew up in a traditional home, Jewish home, but he married a Catholic. And because he was interested in having Holy Communion with her, he went and wanted to, know a little bit about the faith, and he ended up turning up at a revival meeting. And he said, it was seriously a bit weird. So you've got someone blowing the shofar, you've got people speaking in tongues, you've got people lying on the floor, but he stayed and he listened. And then there was an altar call, and he went forward. He said, I was compelled to go forward. And he said, I got prayed for, and I knew something had happened because I was shaking. I was hot and cold and hot and cold. So he goes back to his seat, and he looks at his hands, and he says there was fluid pooling in the middle of his palms, and it was gold, and it was like golden fluid. And so he wiped it off. He checked the Bible. Did I touch anything? And he said, no, it kept coming and pooling in the palm of his hands. And so he went home to show his wife. By that time, it had disappeared, but instead there were two blisters, the signs of a coin. And then when the blisters burst, it left raw skin. And one of his friends, which happened to be Sid Roth, the guy who does, supernaturally, never mind. But he said, I think it's actually a sign that you're anointed for healing. And in the years to come, he actually did go and ministered in healing. I found another cool story, and I'll finish with that one. It's a Jewish woman, Alice, married, and I listened to her testimony. And she said again, she grew up in a traditional home in New Jersey, And all she knew was about Jesus, that Jesus was the false God of the Gentiles. She didn't know much about Jesus. She said she thought he was Italian and Catholic. And so when she left school, her mom wasn't really keen on her going to, where did she want to go, to Florida? Because mom said, oh, there aren't many Jews in Florida, which she says, like, of course there are. But anyway, eventually the mom relented and she said, it's okay, you can go and study there if you go to synagogue once a week and if you find a Jewish group, a student group. And she was like, yeah, I'm fine with that. So she went. And she said she did come across quite a few Christians, but she brushed them off, like wasn't interested. And then she found a job at an ice cream parlor. And one day, she says, this really tall guy, literally 7-foot tall guy, comes and, wanted ice. And he had piercing blue eyes and a massive Bible, white Bible under his arm. His name was Alan, and he struck up a conversation with her and told her about Jesus and that Jesus was her Messiah. And then over the following 7 months, she said, like, it was weird, but every time I went to the mall or into a shop, he turned up as well, and he, kept ministering to her and talking to her. They exchanged phone numbers, and he kept ringing her, telling her about Jesus. And then she said after 7 months or so, like, it really had an effect on her. And what got to her was that the fact that Jesus had given his life as a sacrificial lamb. And she said, as a Jew, the meaning of sacrifice, like, it really hits home. And so she was like, okay, knelt down, gave her life to Jesus. On the same day, she wanted to give him a ring, and the phone was disconnected. And she was like, that is so bizarre. So, and from that day on, she didn't see him anymore. She went to the same places where they had run into each other, but he wasn't there. And that went on for a year, and she said she was heartbroken because they had actually become friends. So then she went to a different church, became friends with one of the ladies there, and was invited to her home. And as she came into the home, she saw this painting on the wall of Alan. And she's like, oh, where did you get the painting? Who did that? And so the friend and her husband, they explained to her that their friend had been quite sick, and she was actually on a deathbed. And this angel turned up and said to her, like Jesus says, you're not going to die, I'm going to heal you. And angel left, and she, after, painted a picture of the angel, which was Alan. So God and his angels are actually actively involved in bringing Jesus to the Jews, and God is asking us to be involved too, bring the gospel to the Jews, and also speak up in the face of injustice. Now, the Jews are God's chosen people, and they have been persecuted over the centuries more than any other nation, and that is because they are a sign to the world that God is real, that he intervenes in history, and the biblical prophecies are evidence for that. So if you pay attention to what is happening right now, and like I said, I wasn't aware of all of this, but things are happening among the Jewish people. So we can discern God is doing something, and he wants us to join in. He's calling us to be part of his plan for revival, which unites Jewish and Gentile people under the name of Jesus. Amen.